Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And on this podcast, my goal is to help you smash the gates of storytelling. And I don't know, I'm trying to do more of the barbarian motif. It's not really working, but that's fine. Today, we're going to do something super fun. We're going to take a look at a listener question. This is from one of you listeners. I haven't read it yet, but Natalia has sent me the email and everything, and so I'm going to read it out loud. I'm looking forward to it for sure. But before we get into all of that, little bit of housekeeping. So always forget to do this. If you like the show, whether you are watching some of our episodes on YouTube or if you're listening to the podcast wherever you're listening to this podcast, please consider subscribing, of course, but also if you have a review or a rating, something like that, that would be super helpful for us. And just give us back any feedback, that's something that might help us with the show, make it better, all that good stuff. We've been definitely getting some fun comments and things on the YouTube channel. Really appreciate the fan interaction and a lot of the conversations happening there too. But, and also we have our email. So we're going to read one today. But our email, if you don't know, is fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. It's in the show notes if you want to hit us up. And then we do have the Discord as well, the In Between Drafts Discord, where you can go hang out with other barbarian writers for sure, including me. But okay, that's enough of that. Let's actually get into this email. And so I have it right here. Okay, so the subject line is advice on third person close from my epic fantasy. Hey there. First off, I just want to say I love fantasy writing for barbarians. You have a way of breaking down craft without making it feel like homework, and it's been a huge help in refining my approach to storytelling. Thanks so much. I'm working on an epic fantasy novel and trying to nail down my narrative style, but I'm leaning toward third person close. I want to make sure I'm using it effectively. I've read a lot of advice on POV, but I'm still wrapping my head around the benefits of third close and how to really make it shine. My main concerns. Number 1, what are the biggest advantages of third person close for an epic fantasy? I know it helps with character immersion, but are there specific ways it strengthens world building or pacing? Number 2, how do you maintain deep perspective without slipping into first person territory? I want that immersive effect, but I don't want it to feel like first person with different pronouns. Number 3, what are some common pitfalls when writing in third close? Anything I should be avoiding as I refine my approach? I'd love to hear your thoughts, or if there are any books you'd recommend as examples of third close done well in epic fantasy. Thanks for all the insight you bring to the show. I appreciate the work you and the producers do. Best, Joey. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joey. That was wonderful to read and really appreciate all the compliments and everything. Yeah, man, my mind is already spinning at ideas because when it comes to third person close, that's actually where I got my start as a writer. Third person close is what I started with myself. So I definitely am a fan of it. These days, I still do third person close for sure, but I also write a lot of first person these days as well, particularly in my novels. I write a lot of third person close in my short stories though, although I say that and literally the most recent short story I wrote, which is a literary short story, that one's actually in first person, but there's a good reason for that if I'm ever able to get it out there and can actually speak to it more specifically. But okay, so yeah, this is super interesting. And I, just kind of looking at this email again. So they had 3 questions. The first one here is, what are the biggest advantages of third person close for an epic fantasy? So that is a great question. And I do want to kind of start by explaining what third person close is so that people listening will understand, like, just in case you aren't as aware, right? Yeah, let's jump into that first. This is also, third person close is also known as third person limited. And this is widely considered a point of view that it's a narration that sticks closely to one character's perspective. That's not the 100% definition, but it's pretty close. And it's different from omniscient, right? Where the narrator knows everything that's happening everywhere. They're in everybody's heads and all that. Third close keeps the focus really tight. It only reveals what the point of view character sees and knows and feels and so on. And so one of the things that I really like about third person close too is that, well, actually, first I'll say, how does it compare to the other perspectives? Well, third person omniscient, like I said before, it's kind of like you have a god hovering over the world and they kind of dip in and out of the characters' heads however they please. And it's a very powerful way to tell a story, but in many cases, it's out of fashion because it also feels really distant. It feels like the narrator is really disconnected from what's happening in the story. And then you have first person, which just drops you right inside the character's mind completely, right? So it's text like, I did this, I felt that. It's very, very intimate, but first person can be very limiting in scope. And then finally, we have third person close, which in many ways, it can give you the best of both worlds because you get that deep immersion without actually being locked into the first person limitations. And you do still see the world through the character's eyes, but you can still describe things that they might not consciously notice, if that makes sense. And so it's very ideal for epic fantasy where world building and internal experience both need a lot of space to breathe. The main disadvantage of it, and I guess we'll get into it, but the first one that comes to mind is word count. Really, word count tends to just be a little bit bloated when you do third person because you have to keep seeing the character's name and all of that. But very easy ways to get around this. It is epic fantasy, so you have a lot of leeway when it comes to word count compared to, for example, YA fantasy and things like that. So I assume for this epic fantasy, by the way, that Joey is writing something in the adult space since they didn't specify YA or middle grade. So anyway, let's get into it. Okay. So the biggest advantages for third person close, I already kind of touched on it before because, the main one being it strikes a nice balance. You get the personal, immersive connection to the character, and you get to see the world through their eyes. You get to feel what they feel, that kind of thing. And it still has that flexibility of third person. So in epic fantasy, when you have to juggle all of these kind of sprawling world building and complex plot elements, third person close can just really, really help you deliver that in a way that's satisfying. And so think of it this way: third person omniscient gives you the whole map, right? But third person close lets you ride alongside the character inside that world, and you get to experience it step by step. You don't just learn that the ancient ruins are ominous, you can feel the dread in the character's gut as they're in these ancient ruins. You can hear their heartbeat quicken as shadows creep along the stones or something. I don't know. But yeah, it's that kind of immersive storytelling that keeps readers really hooked for hundreds and hundreds of pages. There's a reason why third person in particular is something that a lot of fantasy readers actually will prefer to the exception of first person. I was like this when I was kind of like binge reading a lot of fantasy stuff. I would not read first person fantasy novels for a while. The only first person I would read, I went through a phase where I would only read YA stuff that was first person or maybe literary stuff. But when it came to fantasy, if I saw that the fantasy was first person, I genuinely wouldn't read it. And it was I don't know if I should call it a prejudice, but I just had this expectation that if it was first person, it wasn't going to be as beautiful a prose, which I think was unfair on my part because I think I was kind of limited on, and I had been burned by some experiences where I felt like, no, I want the kind of third person novel format that I'm used to, and that is third person close. There are a lot of other folks who, it's not that they dislike first person compared to third person close, it's that to them, first person, first of all, is a red flag. And also, it's a lot harder to do well in the epic fantasy space. There are a lot of folks who say that if it is first person, you have to do it right. And most people don't do it right, in their opinion. The idea is that most who do the first person thing typically use it as a crutch more than anything else. So could definitely talk about that a lot more, but we'll keep moving on. So the other question here, I already gotta make sure I have it right. How do you maintain deep perspective without slipping into first person territory? Yeah, maintaining deep perspective is super important. And this is the tightrope act of third person close, right? Because you do want that deep immersion, but you also need some slight narrative distance. So how do you thread that needle? And I think there are a few things to keep in mind. For one thing, you need to filter less and experience more. So you have to avoid phrases like he thought, she noticed, he realized. Instead of saying she noticed the dagger was gone, just say the dagger was gone. Personally, I wouldn't even say it that way. I think I would say the dagger had gone missing, mainly because I don't like using the word was in that kind of way. But anyway, but yeah, we know that the character is noticing this because we're in her head. Another thing is to always maintain your character voice, even in third close, because the prose should subtly reflect the character's personality and their worldview. So a battle-hardened warrior and a scholarly mage, they shouldn't just speak differently, they should think differently. And that should shape how the prose itself is written. I was just writing a story where I have a bunch of pirates and I have an apothecary. And as I was doing my revisions, I really wanted to make the thoughts of the apothecary really feel like, how would an apothecary think and process information in a way that's different from this character who is this kind of, roguish pirate, right? So it has to be a bit different, and it makes the writing more enriching. It actually, not just the prose itself, but it's a better experience for the reader, because then it starts to feel like the characters are really distinct. And if you're going to have multiple POV, which we did a whole episode about multiple POV and how to do it, but if you are going to do something like that, you do need to maintain that character voice as much as possible. And finally, I'd say you really need to be strategic when it comes to interiority. So interiority is anything involving, the stuff that isn't dialogue or exposition, but really the navel gazing. So the character, maybe the main character, kind of reflecting on what's happening and kind of narrating themselves. And so unlike first person, where internal monologue can just really take the center stage, especially stylistically, third person close thrives more when it balances the kind of deep insight with external action of the characters. And so what I mean is, if you have too much internal monologue, then you might as well be using first person. But if you use too little, you might as well be doing third person omniscient. So you have to be strategic about when to use interiority, how to use it, and to lean into the strengths of third person. Third person isn't the strongest at interiority. First person is. It's reading somebody's diary is always going to be more compelling than reading a biography of somebody's life. This is what I think of this person versus here is me, right? That there's always going to be just that immediacy. So you have to lean into the strengths of third in that way. And so if you're going to lean into third, you have to understand that interiority should not be overbalanced here, because it's just not going to be the strongest element of the writing. You have to be a little bit more balanced, and that's okay. It's a good restraint. It's a good constraint to have in your writing, because it just means that you know your tools and how to use them best. Okay, so there was another question here. What was it again? Boy, this is fun. Okay, so yeah, the third question was, what are some common pitfalls when writing in third close? Great question. There are a lot of traps with third person close. I especially noticed these sorts of things when I was working on a couple of my first novels, because I was running into a lot of difficulties when it came to making the third person close have voiciness. So the idea of it really reading, like not being dry, right? Like having some personality to it. That's a huge pitfall that people tend to have, is that there's way too much exposition and the narrator voice just doesn't blend enough into the character voice. And so, yeah, it can be very, very vanilla. But a big one would be head hopping. So third close, it means that you are sticking with one character's perspective at a time. And when you switch to another character, you have to make it clear and apparent. So if you're in the POV of one character and then suddenly in the same scene, you are dipping into the thoughts of somebody else, then that is an instant immersion breaker. It takes somebody right out of the novel, and they'll probably be like, oh, this person doesn't know what they're doing, right? Again, if you need multiple POVs, we have a whole episode about this, but you can do a clean break. You can do a scene break. You can do a chapter break, that sort of thing. It can be fun to outline your novel in that way and make a game out of the different ways you segment everything. Another one would be over explaining. And this one is honestly pretty sneaky, because you're going to be inside the character's head, which means you don't need to spell out every single emotion that they have. This kind of ties into the interiority thing too, but you got to trust the reader sometimes. If your character's hands are trembling and their breath is shallow, you don't need to say they felt afraid. Like, we get it, right? You can just sort of use the sensory details to get the point across. And then finally, I'd say that a big trap would be forgetting the world around the character, because third close, it can make it really tempting to stay locked inside the character's head. But you have to remember that they're still in this vast living world, which means you have to keep these sensory details that you're hopefully bringing, in your scene description. You have to keep those details really strong so that the reader isn't just floating in this void of a character's thoughts and feelings. I mentioned navel gazing before. That's really what I'm talking about here. Navel gazing could be it's one of those things where you're reading maybe like 2, 3 pages and nothing happens. It's just the character being like, and then, blah, 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 this, blah, 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 that, soft flashback. This person is like this. And it's like, where's the action? The world isn't doing anything. It's just this character standing frozen in time. It's a very annoying thing for sure. So hopefully that gets everything across that I wanted. Lastly, they did ask for book recommendations for third person close, specifically an epic fantasy. And the first one I thought of, only because the book right now is literally on my desk, anything by Robin Hobb, the Farseer trilogy for sure, but Live Ship Traders too. I have it, just happen to have it right here. Live Ship Trader, or Ship of Magic, is the first book, but I think Robin Hobb, true master when it comes to deep third person narration. The perspective of the characters tend to be really intimate. You really feel what those characters are feeling. So always recommend Robin Hobb for that. I would also say anything by Joe Abercrombie, but specifically the first Lost series. I know a lot of people have read the stuff that I'm mentioning here, but they're great examples for a reason. I think that Joe Abercrombie in particular is quite good at the more gritty version of this. And I do think that compared to a lot of other books, specifically like A Song of Ice and Fire, similarly, every POV character tends to have a very distinct narrative voice that makes their third close really shine. So yeah, thanks again so much for the question. I think that third close, it's a phenomenal tool for epic fantasy, and it, with the right balance of immersion and voice and control, it can make your world and your characters unforgettable, quite honestly. So hope all of that helps, and yeah, keep on writing like a barbarian. Be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.